I've often reflected, in the years since that extraordinary weekend at Ravenshollow Manor, that there are few things more unsettling than an object that defies the natural order of things. A clock that runs backward, a portrait whose eyes seem to follow one about a room, or, as I discovered on that fog-shrouded November evening, a candle that simply refuses to be extinguished, no matter what force of nature or human will is brought to bear against its stubborn flame. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, penned in the elegant hand of Lady Constance Ravenshollow, a woman whose reputation for eccentricity was exceeded only by her considerable fortune. "My dear Captain Hastings," the letter began, "I find myself in need of witnesses to what may prove either a triumph of scientific reasoning or a most embarrassing defeat. I have wagered a considerable sum with certain members of the Archaeological Society that the famous Ravenshollow candle, which local legend claims has burned continuously in our family chapel for over 3 centuries, can be extinguished by purely natural means. The demonstration is set for Saturday evening. Your presence and that of your remarkable friend, Monsieur Poirot, would lend considerable credibility to the proceedings." Poirot, when I presented him with the invitation, had raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow and adjusted his tie with that precise gesture that indicated his interest was thoroughly aroused. "A candle that will not die, mon ami. How very provocative. Tell me, what does science say of such phenomena?" "Presumably that they don't exist," I replied, settling into my chair with the morning paper. "Lady Constance seems determined to prove the point publicly. Apparently, there's been quite a stir in the county about it." "Ah, but of course there has been," Poirot murmured, his grey eyes taking on that peculiar gleam I had learned to associate with the most perplexing of cases. "When legend and logic collide, mon ami, there is always friction, and where there is friction," he made a small, eloquent gesture with his hands, "there is often fire." Ravenshollow Manor proved to be a sprawling Tudor edifice, its honey-coloured stone walls draped in ivy that had turned the deep crimson of old wine in the autumn chill. The estate sat in a hollow of the Surrey Downs, surrounded by ancient oaks whose bare branches seemed to reach toward the grey November sky like supplicating fingers. As our hired motor car wound up the gravel drive, I caught my first glimpse of the chapel that housed the famous candle, a small Norman structure of weathered stone, its single tower rising like a finger of accusation against the darkening afternoon. We were met at the manor's front door by Jameson, the butler, whose impeccable bearing could not quite disguise a certain nervousness about the eyes. "Lady Constance is in the morning room with the other guests, gentlemen," he informed us, his voice carrying the measured tones of long service. "I am to tell you that the demonstration will commence at 8 o'clock precisely." The morning room, when we were shown into it, contained an assembly that might have stepped from the pages of a society magazine, though the undercurrents of tension were immediately apparent to anyone possessed of the slightest powers of observation. Lady Constance herself, a handsome woman of perhaps 50 years, with steel-grey hair and the sort of direct gaze that had undoubtedly intimidated lesser mortals for decades, rose to greet us with evident relief. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, how good of you to come. I fear we have assembled quite a contentious little gathering." She gestured toward the other occupants of the room with a wry smile. "May I present Professor Edmund Blackthorne of the British Archaeological Society, who has taken the opposing view in our little wager, Dr. Sarah Whitmore, our local physician and a woman of admirably scientific temperament, Mr. Nicholas Ashford, my nephew and heir, who I suspect hopes the candle proves to be perfectly ordinary, so that he might sell it to the highest bidder when I am gone." The young man in question, fair-haired, perhaps 30 years of age, with the sort of weak chin that suggested a character to match, flushed crimson at his aunt's words, but said nothing. Professor Blackthorne, a portly gentleman with wild white whiskers and the air of one accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, harumphed disapprovingly. Lady Constance, You do yourself and your family's heritage a disservice with such skepticism. The Raven's Hollow candle is a genuine historical artifact, possibly dating to the medieval period. Its properties may not be supernatural, but they are certainly extraordinary. Extraordinary nonsense, interjected Dr. Whitmore, a sharp-featured woman whose manner suggested she had little patience for what she clearly considered medieval foolishness. I've examined the chapel thoroughly. There are no hidden gas lines, no concealed mechanisms. If this candle has indeed burned continuously, there must be a perfectly rational explanation. Of course there must, agreed a new voice from the doorway. We turned to see a thin, elegant man of middle years, impeccably dressed despite the obvious expense of his clothing being somewhat faded. Forgive my tardiness. I'm Sir Reginald Thornbury, Lady Constance's cousin. I've just arrived from London. His smile was charming, but I noticed that it did not quite reach his eyes. I understand we are to witness the debunking of a family legend this evening. How refreshing. Lady Constance's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Reginald, I wasn't certain you would come. Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world, my dear cousin. After all, if the candle proves to be merely ordinary, it would remove certain complications from our family's affairs, would it not? The atmosphere in the room grew noticeably cooler, and I saw Poirot's eyes narrow with interest. Before anyone could respond, however, Jameson appeared in the doorway once more. Dinner is served, my lady. The meal that followed was a masterpiece of English culinary tradition, though the conversation remained strained throughout. Professor Blackthorne regaled us with tales of similar artifacts he had encountered in his travels, while Dr. Whitmore maintained a skeptical commentary on each story. Nicholas Ashford drank rather more wine than was perhaps wise and made several unfortunate remarks about the monetary value of medieval curiosities. Sir Reginald remained charming and urbane, though I detected an undercurrent of something less pleasant beneath his polished exterior. It was Lady Constance herself who seemed most affected by the evening's tensions. Despite her outward composure, I noticed that she ate very little and frequently glanced toward the windows that faced the chapel, as if expecting to see some sign or portent in the gathering darkness. At precisely 8 o'clock, we donned our coats and made our way across the manor's grounds to the chapel. The November fog had thickened during dinner, creating an atmosphere that seemed designed by Providence itself for mysterious doings. Jameson led the way with a lantern, its beam cutting a pale swath through the mist. The chapel door, ancient oak studded with iron, opened with a groan that seemed to echo from centuries past. Within, the air was cold and still, heavy with the scent of old stone and something else. Something that reminded me oddly of exotic spices, though I could not identify the specific fragrance. And there, on the altar, stood the Raven's Hollow candle. It was not what I had expected. Rather than the simple taper I had imagined, this was a substantial pillar of deep red wax, perhaps 8 inches in height and 3 in diameter. Its surface was smooth and unmarked, showing no signs of the centuries of burning that local legend claimed. The flame that crowned it burned with perfect steadiness, casting a warm golden light that seemed to push back the chapel's shadows with unusual authority. "Magnificent, is it not?" Professor Blackthorne whispered, his voice filled with genuine reverence. "Notice how the flame never wavers, despite the draughts in this old building, and observe the wax. After 300 years of burning, it shows no sign of diminishment." Dr. Whitmore approached the altar with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to cutting through superstition with the sharp blade of logic. "Fascinating construction," she admitted grudgingly. "The wax appears to be of an unusual composition, possibly mixed with some sort of preservative compound, but that hardly makes it supernatural." "Then you will have no objection to our little experiment," Lady Constance said, producing from her reticule a small silver snuffer. "Professor Blackthorne has wagered £50 that the candle cannot be extinguished by conventional means." Dr. Whitmore and I maintain that it can. Gentlemen, you are our witnesses." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary demonstration I have ever witnessed. Lady Constance approached the candle with her snuffer and, with a swift, decisive motion, brought it down over the flame. For a moment, the light vanished completely, and we stood in the absolute darkness of the ancient chapel. Then, impossibly, the flame reappeared, not rekindled, but simply there again, burning as steadily as before. Dr. Whitmore, her scientific composure clearly shaken, tried next. She cupped her hands around the flame and blew with considerable force. The candle guttered, the flame bending nearly horizontal, but refused to die. She tried again and again, each attempt more vigorous than the last, but the result was always the same. The flame would diminish, flicker, seem on the very point of extinction, and then reassert itself with quiet persistence. "Preposterous," she muttered, stepping back with her usually neat hair now somewhat disheveled. "There must be some mechanism, some hidden source of ignition." It was then that Nicholas Ashford, perhaps emboldened by the wine he had consumed at dinner, lurched forward with a laugh that held more than a hint of hysteria. "Let me try," he declared. "If science cannot conquer this bit of medieval trickery, perhaps brute force can." Before anyone could stop him, he had seized the candle bodily, raising it above his head as if to dash it against the stone floor. Lady Constance cried out in alarm. Sir Reginald stepped forward with a sharp word of protest, and Professor Blackthorn's face went white with horror. But Nicholas Ashford never completed his intended act of vandalism. As he stood there, the candle held high, his expression suddenly changed. The drunken bravado drained from his features, replaced by something that might have been fear, or perhaps recognition. His grip on the candle loosened, and it fell from his nerveless fingers. I expected to see it shatter on the chapel floor, its mysterious flame finally extinguished by simple gravity. Instead, the candle landed upright on the stone flags with a soft thud, its flame burning as serenely as ever, as if nothing whatsoever had occurred. Nicholas Ashford, however, did not remain upright. He swayed once, twice, and then collapsed beside the altar, his face already taking on the greyish pallor that I had learned to associate with sudden death. Dr. Whitmore was beside him in an instant, her fingers seeking a pulse at his throat, her ear pressed to his chest. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she looked up at our shocked faces with an expression of complete bewilderment. "He's dead," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I cannot determine the cause. There are no obvious injuries, no signs of violence. It's as if—" She paused, glancing at the candle, which continued to burn, with its impossible steadiness. "It's as if he simply stopped." And so it was that the demonstration intended to debunk a family legend became instead the scene of a death as mysterious as the candle that would not go out, a death that would soon require the particular talents of a certain Belgian detective whose reputation for solving the impossible was exceeded only by his confidence in the power of the little grey cells. The fog swirled about the chapel windows like the breath of ancient ghosts, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour with a sound like a funeral knell. For several heartbeats, none of us moved. The silence was so complete that I could hear the soft whisper of the candle flame, a sound that should have been inaudible beneath the November wind rattling the chapel windows. Nicholas Ashford lay motionless beside the altar, his face bearing that peculiar greyish pallor I had learned to associate with sudden death, while above him the impossible candle continued its serene vigil. It was Poirot who broke the spell of horrified fascination that had settled over our small assembly. Moving with his characteristic precision, he approached the fallen man and knelt beside Dr. Whitmore, his grey eyes taking in every detail with the intensity of a scholar examining a particularly complex manuscript. "Permit that no one else approaches," he said quietly, his voice carrying that gentle authority which had opened so many doors to truth over the years. "Dr. Whitmore, you have made your examination, yes? Then we disturb nothing further until the proper authorities arrive." Dr. Whitmore nodded, her professional composure clearly shaken. "I've checked for pulse, for breathing, for any signs of trauma. Nothing. His pupils are normal, no obvious discoloration, no unusual odors that might suggest poisoning. It's quite extraordinary and deeply troubling." Lady Constance swayed slightly, catching herself against the altar rail. "This is impossible," she whispered. Nicholas was perfectly well at dinner. Intoxicated, perhaps, but not ill. How can a man simply stop? "An excellent question, madame," Poirot murmured, his examination methodical and unhurried. He studied Nicholas's hands with particular attention, noting the position of the fingers, the color beneath the nails. "Hastings, observe if you please. The right palm. What do you see?" I leaned closer, following his gaze. There, clearly visible in the candlelight, was a small reddish mark on the young man's palm, a stain that might have been wax, though it seemed to shimmer with an odd iridescence. "Wax from the candle," I suggested. "Perhaps, or perhaps something more interesting." Poirot rose, brushing an invisible speck from his immaculate trousers. "Tell me, Lady Constance, this artifact has been in your family for many generations. What do you know of its origins?" Lady Constance glanced nervously at the other members of our party. "The family records are somewhat incomplete. It first appears in documents from the 17th century, though legend claims it much older. An ancestor who traveled extensively in the East, India, Ceylon perhaps, brought it back as a gift from some holy man. The story goes that it was blessed with protective properties." "Protection," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "How ironic, considering present circumstances." He moved closer to the candle, studying it without touching, and throughout this entire episode, the seizing, the dropping, the death itself, the flame has not wavered once. Professor Blackthorne, who had been cleaning his spectacles with trembling fingers, replaced them and peered at the candle with renewed intensity. "Most remarkable. It burns with the same steady light as when we entered, almost as if—" "As if what, Professor?" "As if it was somehow aware of what transpired." Sir Reginald's laugh held no humor. "Surely you don't suggest the candle killed Nicholas? That's medieval superstition." "I suggest nothing," Poirot replied mildly. "I observe. And what I observe is most curious indeed." He turned to address the group. "It would be wise to summon the local constabulary immediately. This chapel has become the scene of what must be investigated as a suspicious death." Jameson, who had remained a silent shadow near the door, bowed and vanished into the fog. Within 20 minutes he returned with Inspector Harwick, a lean, sharp-featured man whose intelligent eyes immediately marked him as more perceptive than the typical country policeman. "Monsieur Poirot," the inspector said, recognizing him immediately. "I might have known. What have we here?" "A young man who appears to have died of no discernible cause while handling an object of supposed supernatural properties," Poirot replied. "The circumstances are, shall we say, provocative." Inspector Herrick examined the scene with professional thoroughness, listening carefully to Dr. Whitmore's medical observations and Poirot's preliminary findings. "Right then," he said finally. "We'll need statements from everyone present. The library, I think, would serve well for interviews." As the inspector began directing the bewildered witnesses from the chapel, Poirot lingered for a moment, his gaze once more drawn to the candle. He extended his hand toward the flame, not to touch it, but to feel the air around it. Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Most illuminating," he murmured, and I could not tell whether he intended the pun. The candle burned on, casting its unwavering light upon the ancient stones, while outside the fog pressed against the windows like something alive and hungry. The stage was set not merely for a police investigation, but for a delicate battle of wits against forces both seen and unseen. As we filed out into the November night, I caught Poirot's eye. His expression was thoughtful, his grey cells already working upon the puzzle that had been so dramatically presented to us. "The game, as they say, is afoot, mon ami," he whispered, "and this particular game promises to be most interesting indeed." The library at Ravenshollow Manor possessed that particular atmosphere of accumulated wisdom and genteel decay that characterizes the finest English country houses. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their gilt lettering catching the lamplight like scattered coins, while the scent of old paper and beeswax mingled with the coal fire's warmth. Inspector Herrick had arranged chairs in a semicircle facing the massive oak desk, transforming the scholarly retreat into an impromptu interview room. Poirot positioned himself slightly apart from the group, his sharp eyes moving methodically from face to face with the precision of a jeweler examining stones of questionable quality. I recognized that expression. He was cataloguing every gesture, every fleeting emotion, filing away details that would later prove crucial. "Now then," Inspector Herrick began, settling behind the desk with his notebook open, "let's establish the sequence of events clearly. Lady Constance, you organized this demonstration." Lady Constance sat rigidly upright, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "That is correct. The local archaeological society had been making rather extravagant claims about the candle's properties. I felt it was time to apply rational thinking to what is obviously folklore." Her voice remained steady, though I noticed the tremor in her fingers. "Nicholas was my nephew. He could be impetuous, perhaps too fond of drink, but he was family. To die like that—" She paused, composing herself. "It defies comprehension." Sir Reginald lounged with studied casualness that fooled no one. When called upon, he offered a smooth, almost rehearsed account. "I arrived from London just before dinner, Inspector. Business matters requiring personal attention. Financial affairs, you understand." His fingers drummed silently against the chair arm. "I was unaware of the candle demonstration until joining the others." "And this business?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "It concerned the estate, perhaps?" A flush appeared in Sir Reginald's cheeks. "My financial affairs are hardly relevant to poor Nicholas's unfortunate demise. On the contrary, mon ami, everything is relevant until proven otherwise." Poirot's grey eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "You spoke earlier of complications that might be removed if the candle proved ordinary." "What did you mean?" Lady Constance answered before her cousin could respond. "The family trust contains certain provisions regarding the candle. If proven genuinely supernatural, the estate passes to the church upon my death. If not, it reverts to the nearest male heir." Her gaze moved pointedly to Sir Reginald. "Nicholas stood to inherit everything, assuming the candle could be debunked." "And now that Nicholas is dead?" Inspector Herrick asked quietly. "Now the inheritance passes to Reginald, regardless of the candle's properties. The trust is quite specific on that point." The silence that followed was profound. Professor Blackthorne, when questioned next, launched into a passionate defense of the candle's historical significance. "A documented artifact, Inspector. My research has uncovered references to similar objects in medieval texts. The phenomenon may be unusual, but hardly unique." He fidgeted with his watch chain. "I examined it earlier, in situ with Lady Constance present. No mechanism, no hidden apparatus. The composition appears resinous, with an unusual wick construction." "You were near Nicholas when he seized the candle?" Poirot asked. "Opposite him, perhaps 2 yards away. I saw him lift it, saw his expression change. For an instant—" The professor swallowed. "For an instant, I thought divine wrath might manifest." "Nonsense, of course. But the mind plays tricks. Dr. Whitmore maintained her professional composure despite obvious strain. From a medical perspective, his death is an anomaly. No external trauma, no indication of poisoning, no symptoms consistent with any condition I'm familiar with. His heart simply ceased beating without warning. She paused, struggling with the implications. The only common factor was his direct contact with that candle. "You mentioned a reddish mark on his palm," Poirot observed. "It appeared to be wax, though I examined it only superficially given the circumstances. I didn't consider it significant at the time." "Ah, but sometimes, Doctor, the smallest detail is the most significant." Poirot smiled faintly. "And the fragrance in the chapel. I detected something unusual, almost like exotic spices. Is this customary?" Lady Constance looked surprised. "I hadn't noticed any unusual scent." "Perhaps," Poirot conceded, his eyes twinkling. "Or perhaps a memory of ancient origins, stirred by present circumstances." Jameson, when summoned, maintained his professional composure despite obvious distress. "The chapel key remained in my custody, sir. I unlocked it at 7:45 and lit the lanterns. The candle was already burning, as always. I placed the snuffer on the altar rail at Lady Constance's request and waited at the door." "You never tend the candle directly?" I asked. His gaze flickered toward the doorway. "There is no tending required, sir. It burns as you saw it. If I may say so, it is not something a man handles eagerly, even were it ordinary." When the interviews concluded, Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing at the fog-shrouded chapel. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "A young man dies mysteriously while handling an object of disputed properties, and his death conveniently resolves a complex inheritance issue." He turned back to face the group. "One might almost think the candle chose its victim with considerable care." The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a door creaked on its hinges. The game was indeed afoot, and the stakes were proving far higher than anyone had initially imagined. Inspector Harwick closed his notebook with a decisive snap, though his expression remained deeply troubled. "I'll need to examine everyone's belongings before we proceed further. This death occurred under highly suspicious circumstances, and I intend to leave no stone unturned." The search began with Sir Reginald's quarters, where Jameson produced the spare keys with obvious reluctance. Harwick's methodical examination of the leather cases yielded two discoveries that sent a ripple of tension through our small assembly. First, wrapped carelessly in evening socks, lay a brass key of unmistakably ecclesiastical design. Second, tucked into a side compartment, was a small brown bottle with a deteriorated label. "The chapel key," Harwick announced, holding up the brass artifact. "Care to explain why you failed to mention this during questioning, Sir Reginald?" Sir Reginald's composure cracked slightly. "My late uncle had duplicates made years ago. I kept one as a memento, hardly relevant when Jameson held the primary key all evening." Dr. Whitmore examined the bottle with professional interest, her face growing pale as she read the faded label. "Tincture of aconitine," she announced. "Monk's hood extract. This is a powerful cardiac poison, illegal in private hands." "A liniment prescribed by my physician," Sir Reginald protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "No reputable doctor prescribes aconitine now," Dr. Whitmore replied sharply. "It can be absorbed through the skin and cause fatal heart arrhythmias within minutes." Harwick's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. A duplicate key to the chapel, a deadly poison, and the strongest financial motive in the house. The case appears quite clear. But Poirot stepped forward, his grey eyes studying the evidence with characteristic precision. "Permit me to observe certain details, Inspector. The bottle's cork. Notice how it is hardened with age, the seal unbroken. The residue around the neck is uniform, undisturbed. To open and reseal this without detection would require considerable expertise." He moved to examine the key, turning it carefully in the lamplight. And this brass shows the green patina of years. No recent polishing from use, no fresh scratches. If Sir Reginald used this key recently, it has left no trace." Sir Reginald's relief was palpable, though he attempted to maintain his dignity. "I appreciate your scientific approach, Monsieur Poirot." "Science, yes, but also psychology," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, what brought you to Ravenshollow with such urgency?" The question seemed to deflate him entirely. "Financial ruin," he admitted quietly. "My investments have failed catastrophically. I came hoping Constance might advance funds against my inheritance expectations, though I knew the estate itself is mortgaged beyond redemption." Lady Constance's expression hardened. "The only assets of real value are the manor itself and certain artifacts, including that accursed candle. Which brings us to a crucial point," Poirot continued. "The timing of tonight's demonstration was most convenient for someone wishing Nicholas dead. But would a rational murderer trust to an impulsive act that might not occur? Lady Constance could as easily have seized the candle." Dr. Whitmore, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "I've been reconsidering Nicholas's death, Monsieur Poirot. The speed was extraordinary, as if he'd been struck by lightning. The only explanation I can conceive is some form of contact poison, something applied to the candle itself." "Now we approach scientific territory," Poirot said approvingly. "A substance that acts with such rapidity, leaving minimal trace. It would explain the reddish mark on his palm, would it not?" "Precisely. Something that activates upon contact, perhaps triggered by body heat or the oils of the skin. It's the only medical explanation that fits the observed facts." Inspector Howick nodded grimly. "Then we're dealing with premeditated murder, not supernatural nonsense. Someone prepared that candle as a weapon, knowing Nicholas's impulsive nature would make him the likely victim." Poirot smiled faintly. "Indeed, Inspector, the candle that would not die has become, paradoxically, an instrument of death. Most illuminating." He paused, his gaze moving thoughtfully among the assembled faces. "Though I wonder if our scientific explanation, logical as it appears, might not be precisely what someone wishes us to believe." The fog pressed against the windows like searching fingers, and somewhere in the distance the chapel bell tolled once, a sound that seemed to mock our rational deductions with its ancient, inexplicable resonance. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves, but I suspected that Poirot already perceived a pattern that would prove far more complex than our current theory suggested. The theory of a poisoned candle seemed to provide Inspector Harwick with the rational explanation he craved, and his attention had clearly fixed upon Sir Reginald with the intensity of a hound scenting prey. The discovery of the chapel key and the aconitine bottle had transformed suspicion into what appeared to be certainty. Yet I observed that Poirot remained deeply thoughtful, his grey eyes holding that particular gleam that indicated his little grey cells were working at their most intense capacity. "Sir Reginald Thornbury," Inspector Harwick announced with evident satisfaction, "I am placing you under detention pending further investigation. The evidence against you is compelling, motive, means, and opportunity all clearly established." Sir Reginald's composure finally cracked entirely. "This is preposterous. I may be a fool with money, Inspector, but I am not a murderer. The bottle has been sealed for years, and the key is merely a keepsake from my youth. Nevertheless, you will remain under guard until this matter is resolved," Harwick replied firmly. He turned to address the assembled company. "The rest of you are free to retire, though I ask that no one leave the premises until the coroner arrives tomorrow." But Poirot stepped forward with that gentle authority which had opened so many doors to truth over the years. "Inspector, before we conclude our evening's work, I believe we must return to the chapel. There are certain observations that require verification under present conditions, details that may prove most illuminating." Harwick looked surprised but nodded agreement. "Very well, though I fail to see what more we can learn. The scene has been thoroughly examined." "Ah, but has it, mon ami? We have looked for the obvious, but sometimes it is the subtle detail that reveals the greatest truth. Our small procession made its way once more across the fog-shrouded grounds, Jameson leading with his lantern, casting uncertain shadows through the mist. The chapel door stood exactly as we had left it. The ancient hinges groaned their familiar protest as we entered. The candles still burned with that same unwavering flame, casting its golden light upon the stone altar with serene indifference to the drama that had unfolded around it. Poirot approached the altar with his characteristic precision, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. "Observe, if you please, the silver snuffer that Lady Constance employed in her demonstration." He held the implement toward the candlelight, and there, clearly visible on the inner surface, was a faint reddish residue that caught the flame's glow like a blush. "Shellac or resin," Professor Blackthorne pronounced immediately, his scholarly instincts overcoming his nervousness. "Conservators' varnish often exhibit such coloration in cold air." "Indeed, Professor, and you work frequently with such substances, do you not?" The professor bristled slightly. "Of course. Damar, copal, mastic, they are essential for preservation work. I make no secret of my expertise." "And clove oil?" "I detected its distinctive fragrance in the chapel earlier. A common plasticizer and antiseptic. Many conservators use it to soften old varnish. I had an hour alone here yesterday to examine the candle's construction for the Society's records." Inspector Horrock seized upon this revelation. "An hour alone with the candle, Professor, and intimate knowledge of chemicals that could be used to create a contact poison. This casts your involvement in a rather different light." But Poirot raised a hand for silence, his attention focused on the candle itself. Moving around the altar with the patience of a scholar deciphering ancient texts, he examined every surface with meticulous care. "Most fascinating," he murmured. "The base bears inscriptions in Sanskrit, though much worn by time. Professor Blackthorne, your expertise would be invaluable here." The professor approached with evident excitement, adjusting his spectacles as he peered at the markings. "Extraordinary. I can make out portions of what appears to be a protective incantation. Something about eternal vigilance, the preservation of sacred flame. This confirms the artifact's Eastern origins, precisely as family legend suggests. And notice, if you please, the peculiar construction. The wax appears to have been molded around some sort of metal framework. Observe these slight protrusions, most curious for what should be a simple candle." Dr. Whitmore, who had been studying the flame with renewed intensity, suddenly straightened with an expression of scientific bewilderment. "Monsieur Poirot, look at the flame itself. It burns without producing any visible smoke or wax drippings. That's not merely unusual. It's physically impossible for ordinary combustible material." "Precisely, Doctor, which suggests that our theories about contact poison, while scientifically sound, may not address the true nature of what we are dealing with." As we prepared to leave the chapel, Jameson approached Inspector Harwick with obvious reluctance. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I nearly forgot. This arrived with the afternoon post." He produced a sealed envelope from his inner pocket. Inside was a single sheet of cheap paper, typewritten in uneven characters. "Let the candle choose. If you force its hand, it will take its price. Cancel, or blood will pay." "An anonymous warning," Horrock observed grimly. "When exactly did this arrive, Jameson?" "This afternoon, sir. Delivered by the second post, well before the evening's events." Poirot examined the letter carefully, his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. "Most interesting. Someone knew precisely what would transpire tonight, yet chose to warn rather than prevent." He looked up at the assembled faces, his grey eyes moving methodically from person to person. The question becomes, was this letter written by someone with guilty knowledge, or by someone who feared what might occur? As we filed out into the November night, I caught Poirot's expression in the lantern light. His features held that peculiar combination of satisfaction and concern that I had learned to associate with cases where the obvious solution concealed a far more complex truth. "The evidence against Sir Reginald appears compelling," I ventured as we walked back toward the manor. "Indeed, mon ami, perhaps too compelling. A man facing financial ruin, who stands to inherit everything upon his nephew's death. A key to the scene of the crime and a bottle of deadly poison, both conveniently discovered among his possessions. It is the very tableau of guilt, presented with such ready-made convenience that one must ask, was it designed to be discovered?" The fog swirled about us like the breath of ancient spirits, and somewhere in the distance the chapel bell tolled once, as if marking not just the hour, but the opening moves in a game far more complex than anyone yet suspected. The candle that would not go out had indeed ignited a fire of suspicion, but I began to suspect that Hercule Poirot was already perceiving patterns in the smoke that would lead us toward a truth none of us had yet imagined. The remainder of the night passed uneasily at Ravenshollow Manor, with Sir Reginald confined under Inspector Harwick's watchful guard while the rest of us attempted to find what rest we could after the evening's extraordinary events. I'd been assigned a comfortable chamber overlooking the chapel grounds, and through the fog-shrouded windows I could see the faint glow emanating from the ancient structure. That impossible candle continuing its eternal vigil, as if nothing whatsoever had occurred. Sleep proved elusive, and I rose early to find Poirot already dressed and seated in the morning room, examining the anonymous letter with his characteristic precision. The pale November sunlight filtering through the windows revealed the strain of the previous evening etched in the careful lines around his eyes, though his manner remained as methodical as ever. "Ah, mon ami, you are awake. Excellent. I have been conducting a small investigation of my own." He gestured toward a collection of papers spread across the writing desk. "The anonymous letter, it tells us much more than we initially supposed." "What have you discovered?" "Come. We visit the estate office. Jameson has been most accommodating with the keys." The office smelled of ledgers and drying ink, dominated by a heavy black typewriter whose ribbon left a faint metallic tang in the air. Poirot laid the anonymous letter beside a sheet of the office stationery, then depressed several keys with a pencil, producing ghostly impressions on a scrap of blotting paper. "Observe, if you please. The R sits slightly low. The O bears a flat at its upper curve. Small imperfections that mark each machine as surely as fingerprints." His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "This household typewriter shares the R but not the O. Not our culprit, but most illuminating, nonetheless." We were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Whitmore, who appeared considerably more composed than she had the previous evening. "Gentlemen, I've been conducting further research into Nicholas's death. I spent several hours with my medical texts, and I believe I may have identified the mechanism." Poirot set aside his papers with interest. "Please, Doctor, enlighten us." "The symptoms are consistent with exposure to certain alkaloids that affect the nervous system. There are references in colonial medical journals to similar deaths among Europeans who handled ritual objects in India and Ceylon. The candle itself may contain naturally toxic compounds that become active under specific conditions: perspiration, elevated body temperature, the oils of human skin. A theory that would explain much," Poirot agreed thoughtfully. "Nicholas was intoxicated, his hands perspiring, his body temperature elevated. The perfect conditions for such a reaction." "Exactly. Which would mean his death was accidental, not murder." But Poirot raised a finger, his grey eyes taking on that peculiar gleam I had learned to associate with his most profound insights. "Ah, but consider this, Doctor. What if someone knew of these properties? What if the accident was carefully orchestrated?" He held up the anonymous letter once more. "Let the candle choose. If you force its hand, it will take its price. Most theatrical language, would you not agree? Almost as if the author wished to create a psychological environment where the victim's own actions would lead him to his doom." Dr. Whitmore's eyes widened with understanding. "You suggest the letter was sent not as a warning, but as manipulation." Precisely. Someone who understood both Nicholas's impulsive nature and the candle's lethal properties could predict exactly what would occur. The letter serves to establish the supernatural framework while the true killer remains safely in the shadows. At that moment, Inspector Hercule appeared in the doorway with evident agitation. "Monsieur Poirot, we have a development. Professor Blackthorn's room has been searched thoroughly. His bed unslept in, his chemical supplies missing, and his traveling case gone." The news sent a chill through our small assembly. Harwick's expression was grim as he continued, "Flight suggests guilt. Perhaps our learned professor was more involved than he appeared." But Poirot examined the evidence with his characteristic attention to detail. "Observe the manner of departure, Inspector. Clothing folded with precision, toiletries arranged in perfect order. This is not panic, but methodical preparation." He gathered several sheets of paper from the writing desk. "And these calculations, chemical formulas involving preservation techniques, not the hasty scribbling of a guilty conscience." Before anyone could respond, Lady Constance appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Gentlemen, I must confess something. I asked Professor Blackthorn to leave quietly during the night, after Nicholas's death. I realized the candle represents a danger to everyone in this house. I commissioned him to find specialists in London who might safely neutralize its properties." "You sent him away?" Harwick demanded. "I provided funds and transportation. If anyone can solve this mystery safely, it is Edmund Blackthorn." Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. "Most considerate, Lady Constance, though I wonder if your urgency might not have inadvertently removed our most valuable witness." He moved to the window, gazing toward the chapel. The professor's knowledge of the candle's composition could prove crucial to— His words were cut short by the sudden, urgent pealing of the chapel bell, not the single stroke that had marked the hours, but a continuous, alarmed tolling that seemed to echo across the fog-shrouded grounds with ominous insistence. Through the morning-room windows, we could see a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of the ancient structure. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, his composure finally cracking. "Someone has returned to the chapel." We rushed across the manor grounds with desperate urgency, the chapel bell's frantic tolling cutting through the November morning like a blade. The fog had thinned to wispy tendrils that clung to the ancient stones, and through the mist we could see smoke curling from the chapel windows, not the black smoke of burning timber, but something paler and more acrid that caught in our throats even at a distance. Inspector Hercule reached the chapel door first, his shoulder driving against the heavy oak with determined force. The ancient hinges groaned their protest, but the door swung open to reveal a scene that defied every expectation our morning's theories had prepared us for. The interior was filled with a haze that stung the eyes and carried the unmistakable scent of burning chemicals mixed with something sweeter and more exotic. Professor Blackthorn lay crumpled near the altar steps, his scholarly clothing singed and his breathing labored but mercifully present. Around him, the remnants of what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory smoldered in the pale morning light, glass retorts, copper tubing, and various bottles that spoke of desperate experimentation rather than simple academic research. Dr. Whitmore was beside him in an instant, her medical training overriding any concern for the lingering chemical fumes. "He's alive," she announced with evident relief, though unconscious. "Burns to his hands and face, possible chemical inhalation. We must get him into fresh air immediately." As Jameson and Inspector Hercule carefully carried the professor toward the chapel door, Poirot moved with his characteristic precision to examine the scene. Despite the chaos, the Raven's hollow candle still burned with its impossible steadiness, its flames seemingly untouched by the chemical catastrophe surrounding it. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, his grey eyes taking in every detail with intense concentration. "Observe, Hastings." The professor did not flee in guilt as we supposed, but returned to conduct experiments. These apparatus suggest an attempt to analyze the candle's composition. perhaps to neutralize its dangerous properties as Lady Constance intended. But his attention had already shifted to something far more significant. Moving carefully around the altar, he knelt beside a section of stone flooring where the professor's chemicals had created an unusual reaction. The ancient mortar between the stones had dissolved under chemical action, revealing what appeared to be a hollow space beneath the altar itself. "Inspector Harwick," he called urgently, "we require tools. There is something concealed beneath these stones that may prove most enlightening." Jameson, despite his obvious distress over the professor's condition, produced a crowbar from the estate's tool shed with admirable efficiency. The loosened stones lifted easily, revealing a cavity that had remained hidden for centuries. Within lay a collection of objects that transformed our understanding of the entire mystery: several candles identical to the one burning above us, a manuscript written in multiple languages, and most significantly, a small brass mechanism of intricate and obviously deliberate design. Lady Constance, who had arrived during our excavation, stared at the discoveries with genuine shock. I had no knowledge that such things existed beneath our chapel. The family records make no mention of hidden chambers or additional artifacts. Poirot examined the manuscript with growing excitement, his linguistic abilities serving him well as he translated portions of the ancient text. "This is extraordinary, a detailed account of the candles' creation, written by your ancestor who brought them from the East. They were not blessed by holy men, Lady Constance, but created by alchemists who understood certain properties of rare minerals and exotic compounds." He held up the brass mechanism, its surface green with age, but its construction still clearly visible. "And this device, a timing mechanism designed to regulate the candle's properties. Clockwork, springs, chemical reservoirs. Most ingenious, though hardly supernatural, in the sense we have been led to believe." Dr. Whitmore, who had returned after ensuring Professor Blackthorne was breathing more easily, examined the mechanism with professional fascination. A slow-release system for dispensing compounds into the candle's flame. The alkaloids that killed Nicholas weren't naturally occurring in the wax. They were being dispensed by this device, activated by direct physical contact. "Which would explain the professor's injuries," Inspector Harwick observed grimly. "His chemical experiments must have triggered a massive release of the toxic compounds." But Poirot shook his head, his expression growing grave as he examined the mechanism more closely. "I think not, Inspector. Observe the device more carefully. It has been recently activated, not by chemical accident, but by deliberate manipulation. Someone wound the clockwork, someone who understood its function and intended its consequences." He rose from his examination of the hidden chamber, his grey eyes moving methodically among our assembled faces. "The professor's experiments were interrupted by someone who knew of this chamber's existence, someone who activated the mechanism to create a controlled release of toxic compounds. Professor Blackthorne was not conducting dangerous experiments. He was investigating a murder weapon and nearly became its second victim." The morning sunlight streaming through the chapel windows seemed suddenly cold, and I realized that our investigation had taken a far more sinister turn than any of us had anticipated. The candle that would not go out had revealed its mechanical secrets, but those secrets pointed toward a killer who possessed both intimate knowledge of the Ravenshollow family history and the technical expertise to operate such a complex device. "The question now becomes," Poirot continued quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "who among our small company knew of this chamber's existence, and who possessed both the knowledge and the ruthless determination to use it for murder?" Professor Blackthorne's recovery proved both a blessing and a revelation that transformed our understanding of the previous evening's events. As Dr. Whitmore attended to his chemical burns in the Manor's morning room, his scholarly precision remained intact despite his obvious discomfort, and his testimony provided crucial details that had eluded our initial investigation. "I returned to the chapel before dawn," he explained, his voice hoarse but determined, "not in flight from guilt, but to fulfill Lady Constance's commission. The candle's composition required proper analysis if we were to neutralize its dangerous properties safely. He paused, accepting a glass of water from Dr. Whitmore before continuing. But someone was already there, moving with obvious familiarity around the altar. When I called out, they activated something beneath the stones. I heard the distinct sound of clockwork engaging, followed by that terrible release of toxic fumes. Poirot leaned forward with intense interest. This person, you observed them clearly. Small hands, Professor Blackthorne replied without hesitation. Delicate fingers that moved with practiced confidence over the mechanism. Someone who had operated that device before, who understood its function intimately. Inspector Harwick's expression grew increasingly grim as the implications became clear. Then we're dealing with someone who not only knew of the hidden chamber's existence, but possessed the technical expertise to use its contents as a murder weapon. Precisely, Inspector, Poirot agreed, rising to pace the morning room with his characteristic precision. But observe how this transforms our understanding of Nicholas's death. The timing was not coincidental. Someone prepared that mechanism hours before our demonstration, calculating exactly when the toxic compounds would be released upon direct contact. Dr. Whitmore, who had been monitoring the professor's pulse, looked up with professional fascination. The alkaloid concentration required for such rapid effect would need precise measurement. Too little, and Nicholas might have survived with mere illness. Too much, and the evidence would have been obvious to any medical examination. An excellent observation, Doctor, which suggests our killer possesses not only mechanical knowledge, but chemical expertise as well. Poirot moved to examine the various documents spread across the writing desk, the anonymous letter, the alchemical manuscript, the family records that Jameson had reluctantly produced from the estate archives. His attention fixed particularly on the manuscript's detailed diagrams, where ancient formulas described the candle's composition with scientific precision. Most illuminating, he murmured, tracing a finger across the faded text. The original formula mentions concentrated extracts of Syzygium aromaticum, clove oil, as Professor Blackthorne correctly identified. But notice this additional notation. When heated by sacred flame, the essence becomes as death to those who would defile the vigil. Medieval superstition, Sir Reginald observed dismissively, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Or medieval chemistry, disguised as religious doctrine, Poirot countered gently. Clove oil in concentrated form is indeed toxic, particularly when heated and absorbed through the skin. The mechanism beneath the altar was designed to release precisely such compounds at predetermined intervals. He gathered several items from around the room. The silver snuffer Lady Constance had used, samples of wax from the chapel floor, even the bell rope that had summoned us that morning. Each received his meticulous attention, examined under his magnifying glass, with the patience of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. Observe, if you please, the residue on this snuffer, he announced, holding the silver implement toward the morning light. Not merely wax, but traces of the same compounds found in the manuscript's formulas. Someone handled this device after working with the chemical preparations. Lady Constance, who had been maintaining her composure with obvious effort, spoke quietly. The family records were indeed damaged in a fire during my grandfather's time, but certain knowledge was preserved through other means. Ah, Lady Constance. Now we approach the heart of the matter. Poirot's grey eyes held that particular gleam that indicated his little grey cells had reached a crucial understanding. Knowledge preserved through oral tradition, passed from one generation to the next. Knowledge that would include not only the location of the hidden chamber, but the operation of its deadly contents. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate more than just the room. It revealed the growing certainty that our investigation was approaching its climax. The The candle that would not go out had indeed served its purpose as an instrument of murder, but the hand that wielded it remained hidden beneath layers of deception that only Hercule Poirot's methodical reasoning could penetrate. "At 4 o'clock this afternoon," Poirot announced with quiet authority, "we shall gather in the library for the final revelation. Until then, I have certain inquiries to make and one crucial detail to verify. The truth, mes amis, lies not in supernatural mysteries, but in the very human capacity for calculated murder disguised as ancient legend." The fog had finally lifted from Raven's Hollow Manor, but the shadows of guilt and deception remained as thick as ever, awaiting the brilliant light of Poirot's deductive powers to dispel them forever. The hours between Professor Blackthorn's revelation and 4 o'clock passed with the peculiar tension that precedes the resolution of great mysteries. Poirot spent much of the afternoon conducting what he termed final verifications, his methodical nature requiring absolute certainty before presenting his conclusions to the assembled company. His investigation led us first to the village, where a brief visit to Dr. Whitmore's surgery yielded a discovery of considerable significance. The compact typewriter on her desk bore the same mechanical imperfections, the flattened O, the slightly low R, that marked the anonymous letter warning of the candle's vengeance. When Poirot demonstrated this with a test sheet, the evidence was undeniable. "Most illuminating," he murmured, examining the result through his magnifying glass. "The machine that typed our prophetic warning. Though as to who employed it, that requires psychological deduction rather than mechanical analysis." Our return journey took us through the manor's abandoned conservatory, where Poirot's sharp eyes detected traces of recent chemical activity. Glass retorts bearing the residue of clove oil distillation, copper tubing stained with oxidized compounds, and most significantly, a collection of leather-bound journals documenting years of systematic experimentation with the candle's properties. "Someone has been conducting scientific research into what others dismissed as medieval superstition," Poirot observed, leafing through pages of careful notations. "The handwriting is educated, methodical, the work of a trained mind applying modern chemistry to ancient formulas." At precisely 4 o'clock, we assembled in the library as requested. The afternoon sunlight slanted through tall windows, creating an atmosphere of scholarly solemnity that seemed appropriate for the revelation awaiting us. Inspector Harwick positioned himself strategically near the door, while the others arranged themselves with obvious tension. Lady Constance occupied her customary chair with aristocratic dignity intact, though I noticed the slight tremor in her hands. Sir Reginald maintained his urbane composure despite the morning's discoveries. Dr. Whitmore sat with professional attentiveness, her medical bag at her feet. Professor Blackthorn, despite his ordeal, had insisted on attending, his scholarly curiosity outweighing physical discomfort. Poirot positioned himself before the assembled company with that quiet authority which had commanded attention in drawing rooms across Europe. His appearance was, as always, immaculate, every detail precise, from his waxed mustache to his geometrically pressed suit. "Mes amis," he began, his accented English carrying clearly through the library's silence, "we have investigated what appeared to be either supernatural phenomenon or elaborate coincidence. The truth, as so often occurs, proves both more mundane and more tragic than either explanation suggests." He moved to the writing desk, where evidence had been arranged with characteristic precision: the ancient manuscript, the brass mechanism, chemical residues, and the journals from the conservatory. The Raven's Hollow candle is indeed remarkable, but its properties are entirely scientific. The original alchemists created a formula combining rare waxes with compounds that react to human contact under specific conditions. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with professional interest. "The alkaloid poisoning that killed Nicholas." "Precisely, Doctor. But the mechanism was not activated by accident or supernatural agency. Someone who understood its operation prepared it specifically for Saturday evening's demonstration, calculating exactly when the toxic release would occur. He held up the leather journals, their pages filled with chemical formulas and careful observations. These documents record years of systematic experimentation, conducted by someone with both scientific knowledge and intimate family access, necessary to understand the candle's true nature. Poirot's grey eyes moved methodically among the assembled faces. The killer orchestrated Nicholas's death with meticulous precision. The demonstration was designed not to debunk the candle's properties, but to provide perfect circumstances for murder. The anonymous letter served as psychological manipulation, heightening mystery while provoking the impulsive reaction that sealed Nicholas's fate. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room like fog. We are dealing with someone who possesses unique knowledge of family secrets, chemical expertise, psychological insight into human nature, and the ruthless determination to use all three for murder. The silence stretched taut as violin strings, each person aware that Poirot's methodical reasoning was approaching its inexorable conclusion. The candle that would not go out had indeed illuminated a path to truth, though that truth would prove more shocking than any supernatural legend. The identity of this killer, Poirot continued with quiet certainty, will surprise you all. The murderer, Poirot announced with quiet certainty, is someone who possessed not only intimate knowledge of the Ravenshollow family secrets, but also the scientific expertise to transform legend into lethal reality. Someone who understood that the greatest deceptions are built upon foundations of truth. His grey eyes moved methodically across the assembled faces with the precision of a jeweler examining precious stones. Let us first eliminate those who, despite appearances, lack the essential requirements for this particular crime. Sir Reginald, your financial desperation made you an obvious suspect, but the aconitine bottle's hardened cork and the chapel key's undisturbed patina prove these were relics, not recently used instruments of murder. Sir Reginald exhaled slowly, relief evident despite his maintained composure. Professor Blackthorne, your scholarly passion and chemical knowledge seemed damning, but your return to the chapel was driven by scientific curiosity, not murderous intent. Your injuries prove you were nearly a second victim, not the perpetrator. Poirot moved to the evidence table, his movements deliberate and precise. This brings us to the true architect of Nicholas Ashford's death, someone who orchestrated every detail with the methodical precision of a master surgeon. He held up the anonymous letter, its typewritten characters catching the afternoon light. This theatrical warning was created on Dr. Whitmore's surgery typewriter. The mechanical imperfections are unmistakable. But observe the psychological sophistication. The letter was designed not to prevent Nicholas's death, but to establish the supernatural framework that would disguise calculated murder as mystical vengeance. Dr. Whitmore's professional composure remained intact, though I noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Circumstantial evidence, Monsieur Poirot. Anyone could have used my typewriter. Indeed, Docteur, but the chemical journals from the conservatory tell a different story entirely. Poirot opened one of the leather-bound volumes, revealing pages of meticulous notations. Years of systematic experimentation with alkaloid compounds, detailed analysis of the candle's composition, careful calculations of lethal dosages. The handwriting is unmistakably yours, though you attempted to disguise it in places. He produced the silver snuffer, its surface gleaming with that telltale reddish residue. Traces of carbolic acid, your preferred disinfectant, mixed with the alchemical compounds. You prepared the mechanism hours before our demonstration, calculating precisely when the toxic release would occur upon direct contact. Inspector Hurrick stepped forward with growing comprehension. The timing was no coincidence. Exactement, Inspector, but the most damning evidence lies in motive. Poirot's voice grew softer, more dangerous. Dr. Whitmore is not merely the local physician. She is Lady Constance's niece, daughter of the younger brother who supposedly died in India decades ago. She returned to England with medical credentials specifically to position herself within striking distance of the Raven's Hollow inheritance. Lady Constance stared at Dr. Whitmore with dawning horror. Margaret's child. But we were told she died of fever. You were told what was convenient, Dr. Whitmore replied, her professional mask finally slipping to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. My father preserved the family knowledge before his death, including the true nature of the candle. Properties. When I learned of the estate's financial difficulties, I realized that eliminating Nicholas would clear my path to inheritance considerably. Her voice hardened as she continued. The estate would pass to Reginald upon Lady Constance's death, but Reginald is financially ruined and would be forced to sell immediately. As his closest living relative with legitimate claim, I would inherit everything, the manor, the artifacts, and, most importantly, the knowledge of how to exploit their true value. Poirot nodded grimly. A plan requiring years of preparation, medical expertise, and intimate understanding of family psychology. You knew Nicholas's impulsive nature would make him the perfect victim, that his death would appear either supernatural or accidental to casual observers. But you made one crucial error, Doctor. When Professor Blackthorne returned to conduct his scientific analysis, you attempted to eliminate him as well, fearing his investigation would reveal the mechanism's recent activation. Your attack on him provided the final proof of your guilt. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the hidden chamber could have accessed it so quickly in the pre-dawn darkness. Inspector Harwick moved toward Dr. Whitmore with professional authority. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, I arrest you for the murder of Nicholas Ashford and the attempted murder of Professor Edmund Blackthorne. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Dr. Whitmore looked up with a bitter smile. The candle chose its victim well, didn't it? Perhaps there was more truth to the legend than any of us realized. The ancient flame had indeed illuminated the truth, revealing a killer whose medical oath to preserve life had been perverted into an instrument of calculated murder disguised as supernatural justice. The handcuffs closed around Dr. Whitmore's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through the centuries of Raven's Hollow Manor's history. As Inspector Harwick led her toward the library door, she paused and turned back to face the assembled company, her professional composure intact even in defeat. 20 years of careful planning, she said quietly, her voice carrying neither remorse nor defiance, merely the clinical detachment of a physician discussing a failed procedure. 20 years of earning your trust, learning your secrets, positioning myself for this moment. I suppose I should feel some satisfaction that it required Hercule Poirot himself to unravel my work. Lady Constance sat in stunned silence, her aristocratic bearing finally cracking under the weight of betrayal. Margaret's child, she whispered, her voice barely audible. All these years, you were family, and I never knew. To think that every kindness, every professional consultation was calculated toward this end. As the door closed behind Dr. Whitmore and her escort, the library fell into a profound silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Sir Reginald, his earlier relief, now tempered by the complexity of the revelation, moved to offer Lady Constance a steadying hand. The tragedy, Poirot observed gently, moving to gaze out the window toward the chapel, lies not merely in the deception, but in the waste of considerable talent. Dr. Whitmore possessed both the scientific knowledge to understand the candle's properties and the medical expertise to exploit them with lethal precision. Had she applied such abilities to legitimate purposes, she might have achieved genuine greatness. Professor Blackthorne, despite his bandaged hands, managed to speak with scholarly precision. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the chemical preparation. She understood that Nicholas's impulsive nature would make him the perfect victim, that his death would appear either supernatural or accidental to casual observers. Precisely, Professor, but observe how her very profession provided the perfect camouflage. Who questions a doctor's knowledge of chemicals, their access to dangerous compounds, their familiarity with death itself? Poirot turned back to face the group, his grey eyes holding that particular gleam of complete understanding. The anonymous letter was perhaps her masterpiece, designed not to prevent Nicholas's death, but to establish the supernatural framework that would disguise calculated murder as mystical vengeance. Inspector Harrick returned presently with the final documentation completed. "The case is solid, Monsieur Poirot. The evidence is overwhelming, the typewriter, the chemical journals, the mechanism itself. Though I confess, the psychological aspects disturb me greatly. To plan murder over such an extended period, to maintain such perfect deception while living among her intended victims." "It is always the same, Inspector," Poirot replied with a slight sigh. "Human greed, human ambition, dressed in the garments of mystery. Dr. Whitmore did not merely commit murder. She constructed an elaborate psychological trap, using the very beliefs and legends of the family against them." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the question of the candle's fate arose naturally. Lady Constance, having regained some measure of her composure, spoke with quiet determination. "The mechanism will be permanently disabled, and the chapel sealed. I cannot bear the thought of that flame continuing to burn, knowing how it was perverted for such evil purposes." "Perhaps, Lady Constance," Poirot suggested gently, "that would be to grant Dr. Whitmore a final victory. The candle itself was not evil. It was merely an instrument, no more guilty than the scalpel that might be used for healing or harm. Its legend spoke of protection, and in a sense, it did protect by providing the very clues necessary to expose the truth." The wisdom of his words seemed to resonate with the assembled company. Professor Blackthorne nodded thoughtfully. "The artifact belongs in a museum, where it can be studied properly without the burden of family tragedy." As our preparations for departure began, Poirot gathered his few belongings with characteristic precision. "Come, Hastings," he announced, his tone returning to its familiar brisk efficiency. "Our work here is done. The little grey cells have performed their duty, and justice, in its earthly form, will now take its course." The hired motor car waited in the circular drive as the last rays of November sunlight touched the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Manor. Through the chapel windows, we could still see the faint glow of that impossible flame, burning with the same steady persistence that had marked our entire investigation. "You know, Poirot," I ventured as we settled into the leather seats, "it seems almost anticlimactic that such an extraordinary mystery should have such a human solution." My friend smiled, adjusting his mustache with delicate precision. "Ah, but that is always the way, mon ami. We search for the supernatural, the impossible, the mystical, and we find instead the eternal human capacity for both great evil and great ingenuity. Dr. Whitmore's crime was remarkable not for its supernatural elements, but for its psychological sophistication." As our motor car wound down the gravel drive, I glanced back at the manor one final time. The fog had lifted completely, revealing the estate in sharp detail against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that ancient chapel, the Ravenshollow candle continued its vigil, no longer a mystery, but a reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of even the most civilized facades. "The candle that would not go out," Poirot mused, settling back against the upholstery with evident satisfaction, "proved to be the perfect metaphor for truth itself. Persistent, unwavering, and ultimately impossible to extinguish, no matter how cleverly one might attempt to disguise it in shadow." The Belgian detective closed his eyes with the contentment of a man whose little grey cells had once again triumphed over the forces of darkness and deception. Behind us, the eternal flame burned on, its light a beacon of justice in a world too often shrouded in the fog of human ambition and deceit. The end.